Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The kettle on the stove had just begun to rumble when Esso returned from his early morning jog, sweat clinging to his brow like dew on dry harmattan soil. He pulled off his shirt as he walked through the living room, casting a glance toward the tightly shut door of Amy's room. She never woke before 8 unless her favorite vendor was back at the weekend market. Esso and Amy had lived under the same roof for nearly 4 years, their arrangement as seamless as two puzzle pieces from different boxes that accidentally fit. They were the kind of friends who didn't need to say goodnight and never said I love you, yet they'd shared more laughter and silence than most married couples. When people asked, neighbors, curious coworkers, even nosy distant cousins, they would both laugh and say, we're just housemates. But if walls could talk, they'd whisper of movie nights with no lights, of shared meals over cracked plates, of birthday mornings marked by hurried cupcakes and off-key songs. There was no romance between them, no late-night touches or accidental sparks. Still, what they shared had the weight of something sacred. Esso once described it to his brother as a friendship that walks barefoot but never steps on thorns. Amy, meanwhile, said nothing, just smiled and poured tea. Amy stood at the bus park on a humid Saturday morning, waiting for a cab with one arm folded under a polythene bag of thrift clothes, her other hand shielding her eyes from the sun's quiet rage. The stall she'd just left had played old highlife music, the kind that made your chest ache even when the lyrics were cheerful. That was where she met Coffee. He'd bumped into her while trying to escape a group of boys arguing over who owned a particular polo shirt. She had muttered a soft apology even though she wasn't at fault, and he'd responded with a smile so wide it bent his face into something unforgettable. There was something disarming about him, his voice, his humor, the way he lingered even after she'd paid and was ready to leave. He didn't ask where she lived or what she did, just said, you seem like someone who laughs with her eyes, and asked if he could call her sometime. Amy had laughed, a laugh she hadn't heard from herself in months, and handed him her number, not out of desperation, but curiosity. She hadn't been in a relationship since Dunny walked out of her life like rain leaving a cracked bucket, and part of her feared her heart had dried up completely. But Coffee's presence felt like mist before dawn, gentle, promising, and hard to hold back. In another part of Milford Hill, Esso climbed the tiled stairs of his brother's law firm with a swagger he rarely wore. He wasn't one for suits or briefcases, but that day he looked like a man on an unexpected mission. His brother, Kelvin, had promised him an old laptop, and while Esso had come for that, his eyes found something else entirely. She was seated behind a glass door, her head bent over a folder, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who had argued her way out of many storms. Her name was Sarah, and she looked like someone who drank her tea without sugar and her compliments with suspicion. She had the kind of beauty that didn't shout, it whispered. Age sat on her skin like a silk scarf, not a weight. Esso stood at the door longer than necessary, long enough for her to look up and ask, "Can I help you?" in a tone that was polite but unmistakably uninterested. He stammered something about Kelvin and shuffled away, heart-thudding. That night, while washing rice in the kitchen, he told Amy about the woman who had eyes like dusk and a voice that could end wars. Amy chuckled and said, better drink water and mind your age. Esso didn't laugh. The seed had been planted. Life in the apartment resumed its quiet rhythm, but a subtle shift had begun beneath the surface. Amy's phone buzzed more often now, and her face often carried a smile that floated above the ordinary. She and Coffee were getting closer, and Esso noticed, but he said nothing. He was glad for her, truly. Yet something in him stirred each time he saw her humming, as she folded laundry or grinning at a text that made her cheeks flush like a girl in a boarding school love story. Meanwhile, Esso began finding reasons to visit Kelvin's office more often. Once he brought Sarah coffee, claiming he bought an extra cup. She declined. Another time, he sent her a message through the receptionist, quoting a line from a book she'd once mentioned in passing. She didn't reply. Still, Esso persisted, not with the recklessness of a boy chasing infatuation, but with the patience of a man who knew love sometimes wore strange clothes. Sarah was older, yes, but Esso saw something in her eyes that reminded him of unspoken dreams. Amy watched all this unfold with quiet amusement. "She'll chew you and spit you out," she warned him one evening, folding her arms as they stood by the kitchen sink. "Esso's made. Then I'll at least know what it feels like to be tasted by something real." Rain came without warning the next morning, tapping against the window panes like a nosy neighbor. Inside their modest apartment, the smell of fried plantains drifted gently through the hallway as Amy stood barefoot in the kitchen, humming a half-forgotten church hymn. Coffee had texted her before sunrise, something short and sweet, "Thinking of you. Hope your day starts soft." It wasn't grand, but it made her cheeks warm. Amy, who once believed romance had quietly packed its bags and moved on without forwarding address, now found herself standing in front of the mirror more often, wondering if her smile had changed. She'd begun saving Coffee's voice notes like postcards from places she hadn't visited in years. Tenderness, attention, the feeling of being seen. She wasn't rushing things, no. After all, love was no longer a fire in her belly. It was more like coal under the pot, steady, quiet, and useful. But somewhere in the folds of her everyday movements, her heart had begun doing unfamiliar dances, and Esso, ever watchful in his own way, noticed. Not that she had to say anything. In their house, silence often carried more truth than loud conversations. Esso saw the text bubbles, the giggles that slipped out when she thought she was alone, the new lip balm on the dining table. But he never teased. He simply offered to wash the dishes more often, giving her time to daydream. The day Esso returned to his brother's office, carrying a brown file he claimed Sarah had once misplaced, Kelvin barely looked up from his desk. "You're using my firm as your playground now, Abby," he said, half laughing, not expecting a response. Esso didn't mind. He was already standing by Sarah's door, peering in like a schoolboy who'd forgotten his lines in a play. She was scribbling on a yellow notepad, glasses perched low on her nose, and when she looked up, there was something like recognition in her eyes, quick, flickering, and gone in a blink. "I thought this might be yours," Esso said, holding out the file. She looked at it, then at him, then sighed. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." He smiled, the kind that held no mischief but plenty of intent. She took the file, placed it on the desk without opening it, then gestured to the chair across from her. "One coffee," she said flatly. "Black. No sugar. No flirting." Esso didn't move at first. His body seemed unsure whether it had just been invited in or dismissed. But when he sat like a man grateful for rain after planting. That coffee turned into 2, then another 3 across different weeks. Their conversations were rarely romantic. Sometimes it was politics, other times childhood stories, and once a shared joke about courtroom wigs that left Sarah laughing so hard she covered her mouth. It wasn't love yet, but something had begun to grow between them, like a stubborn vine pushing through concrete. One late afternoon, while Amy was trimming her nails in the living room and Esso was fiddling with the broken remote, her phone rang. It was Coffee. She stepped outside to answer it, leaving Esso with the television stuck on static and a mind full of Sarah's laughter from the day before. When Amy returned, her eyes were brighter than the sun outside. "He wants to take me out," she said, biting her lower lip. "Like properly, as in dinner. Tablecloth and all." Esso glanced up, pretending indifference. "You wear heels these days?" he asked. "If I must," she replied, twirling around as if testing imaginary shoes. But beneath the banter, Esso felt a pinch of something he couldn't name. Not jealousy, never that. More like the slow drift of seasons, when you wake up and realize your favorite tree has changed colors overnight. That evening, Amy borrowed one of Esso's black jackets to complete her look. "You look different," Esso said, watching her adjust the collar. "Good different," he added quickly. She smiled. "Maybe it's love. Or the jacket." As she stepped out, Esso stood by the door a second longer than necessary, staring at the place where she had just stood. The silence that followed was not heavy, but it lingered. The following weekend, Sarah invited Esso to a public lecture at the courthouse, a move that surprised even herself. It was about wrongful convictions and prison reforms. Hardly a romantic outing, but Esso said yes without blinking. Sitting beside her among seasoned lawyers and civil rights activists, Esso felt out of place but deeply present. When the talk ended, they walked side by side to her car, words dancing softly between them like evening dust. At some point, Sarah stopped and turned to him. "You know I'm older," she said, out of nowhere, her voice trimmed with seriousness. "Much older. I could be—" "You're not," he interrupted. "You could only be Sarah, the one I can't stop thinking about." She looked at him, long and searching, like someone opening a sealed letter they weren't sure they wanted to read. Then she got into her car without another word. That night, Esso replayed the moment over and over, unsure if he had stepped forward or backward. Back at home, Amy returned from her outing much later, cheeks rosy, perfume lingering behind her like a melody. "He kissed me," she said softly, leaning against the doorframe. Esso, startled out of his thoughts, smiled. "Good," he said, voice level. "Did you kiss him back?" Amy nodded, and that was that. No celebration, no fanfare. Just two friends, each quietly walking toward love, unaware of how entangled their paths were about to become. It was on a Wednesday evening when the air outside smelled faintly of roasted corn and the scent of change. Sarah hadn't planned on coming to Esso's apartment, but life often takes its sharpest turns when we think we're standing still. She had spent the better part of her day in back-to-back legal consultations, her phone buzzing like an unruly child every 10 minutes. By the time Esso's name appeared on her screen with a simple text made ac bono, not perfect, but edible, she found herself laughing despite her fatigue. Maybe it was the sincerity of the message. Maybe it was the way her heart now responded to his name without her permission. She drove over without telling him, and when he opened the door in faded joggers and a stained apron, his face lit up like a match against kerosene. They ate from mismatched plates on the couch, legs brushing slightly, a local film flickering in the background with more drama than sense. Sarah laughed more than she should have, and Esso watched her as one might watch a rare bird land in their backyard, stunned, grateful, and hoping not to scare it away. It wasn't until the movie ended and the silence sat between them like an uninvited guest that she asked, "So, this place, you live here alone?" Esso hesitated, just briefly, then replied, "I share with someone." "She's like a sister." Sarah raised an eyebrow, not in accusation, but as someone adding a puzzle piece to a nearly completed picture. She said nothing more that night, but the silence had changed its weight. Morning slipped in through the curtains with a slow yawn. Amy was already up, lounging in the sitting room with her bonnet half off and her slippers turned sideways on her feet. She sipped from a mug of tea she didn't particularly like, but it gave her hands something to hold while her thoughts wandered. Her mind replayed the way coffee had held her hand the previous night, not with hunger, but with care, as if he was reading a letter and didn't want to smudge the ink. For the first time in a long while, Amy didn't feel like an afterthought in someone else's story. She felt chosen. Just then, the door clicked open, and in walked Esso, with Sarah behind him. Amy straightened, her heart skipping not because she feared what was happening, but because it was happening in her space. Sarah paused, her eyes darting across the room like someone studying a courtroom for allies and threats. "You didn't tell me you live with a woman," she said, arms folding slowly, like shutters closing against a storm. Esso opened his mouth, but words scattered like startled birds. "She's not. Amy is. Look, this isn't what it looks like." Sarah's eyes didn't blink. It looks like my boyfriend lives with another woman. Amy, standing now, cleared her throat. Sarah, I'm Amy. I've known Esso for years. There's nothing, but Sarah was already reaching for her handbag. I need air, she said, voice clipped, and left without slamming the door, which somehow made it worse. Esso stood there for a long moment, like a man watching his shadow walk away. The silence that followed wrapped itself around the apartment like a wet blanket, heavy, uncomfortable, and refusing to lift. Esso didn't eat that day. He didn't shower either. He sat on the balcony as the sky shifted colors, texting and deleting and texting again. Eventually, he found the courage to send her a message, not a long-winded defense, not a romantic plea, just truth stripped bare. He told her about Amy, how they had met through mutual disappointment and survived years of platonic partnership without once stepping over the line. He wrote that love wasn't always about who was in the picture, but about who never left the frame. And that Sarah, with her firm hands and softer eyes, had started to redraw the frame of his life. The reply came the next morning. 3 words, no more. I believe you. Esso sighed so deeply his lungs felt new. Meanwhile, Amy sat quietly on her bed, reading an old message from Coffee. He had asked her to meet his mother next week. She hadn't answered yet. Not because she was afraid, but because she understood the weight that introductions carried, especially now, when the air in the apartment was still learning how to breathe again. That evening, she placed a bowl of hot pepper soup in front of Esso without a word, and he looked at her like someone who had just remembered what comfort tasted like. She'll come around, Amy said, sipping her own soup. Maybe, Esso replied. But deep down, he hoped the vines he'd planted in Sarah's heart hadn't dried overnight. Coffee arrived 2 days later, wearing a button-up shirt that still had a price tag dangling from the sleeve and a nervous smile that made Amy laugh before he said a word. He had come to pick her up for dinner, and she had dressed carefully, each detail deliberate, lip gloss just shy of red, earrings shaped like question marks, shoes she hadn't worn in a year. But as she opened the door and stepped out with Coffee beside her, neither of them expected to find Sarah's car parked outside. Mom? Coffee blinked, confused. What are you doing here? Sarah stepped out, straightening her blouse and looking everywhere but at her son. Esso followed close behind, lips parted as if trying to form the right apology before the wrong impression landed. And then it happened, so casually, so honestly, that it stunned the moment. Sarah leaned forward and kissed Esso on the mouth. Not desperate, not uncertain, just real. Coffee froze. Amy gasped. And the street, already too quiet for comfort, seemed to still further. Mother, Coffee finally said, voice barely above a whisper. Sarah stepped back, her face flushing like a girl caught under moonlight. Esso stood like a misplaced comma, unsure what sentence he belonged in. Let's talk, Sarah said to her son, tugging him gently away. The rest would unfold behind a parked car and a mother's carefully chosen words. Sarah stood next to the car as her son paced slowly, his footsteps crunching on the loose gravel that framed the quiet street. She had practiced so many responses in her mind during the brief walk from Esso's flat to the driveway, but none of them fit the shape of this moment. Coffee, arms folded across his chest, wasn't angry, but he was visibly stunned. I just didn't expect, he trailed off, not finding the right door through which to enter the sentence. Sarah looked at him, truly looked, and saw the boy who used to wait by the school gate with untied shoelaces and a book too heavy for his back. You thought I'd end up with someone older, she said, her voice calm but searching. Someone who talks about retirement and takes fish oil supplements with his breakfast. Coffee let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. I thought you'd end up with someone safe, he admitted. Esso's my age, Mom. Maybe younger. Sarah's gaze didn't flinch. And yet, in all my years, no one has ever made me feel as gently seen as he does. He listens. Not the way people listen to respond, but the way people listen to remember. Coffee rubbed the back of his neck. The truth was, he didn't feel betrayed, just unprepared. The mental picture of his mother's love life had never included someone who could have been his classmate. But seeing her now, her face soft and slightly unsure, he understood something he hadn't put into words before. "Since Dad died," he said, his voice quieter, "you've carried so much alone. If he brings you peace, I won't be the one to take it away." Sarah blinked, and for the first time in years, her son saw water settle in her eyes. They returned to the apartment like two characters walking back on stage after a scene change, the atmosphere inside oddly suspended, like everyone had been holding their breath while they were gone. Amy stood in the hallway, one earring missing and her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her blouse. Esso remained near the door, shoulders stiff, as if bracing for a verdict. Coffee walked in first, his expression unreadable, and then turned around slowly. "Let's start over," he said, extending a hand toward Esso. "I'm Coffee. I believe you are dating my mom." The moment split open like a ripe pawpaw, awkward but strangely warm. Esso took the handshake, his relief a quiet flood beneath the surface. Amy, catching the tone of forgiveness in the room, excused herself and went to her room, not because she felt left out, but because the air suddenly belonged to others. In her room, she sat cross-legged on the bed and stared at the plain ceiling, heart full but mind racing. She had grown used to being the emotional anchor in the apartment, the steady hand, the calm tide. But now she saw Esso glowing in a way she hadn't noticed before. Not bright, not loud, just quietly lit from within. She smiled to herself, then turned off the light and let the silence settle around her like a soft shawl. In the sitting room, Sarah and Coffee eventually sat down, and conversation picked up slowly, like an engine that hadn't run in a while but still knew how to move forward. They spoke about silly childhood moments, old habits, and even shared laughter that smoothed over the last edges of discomfort. It wasn't a perfect evening, but it was a mended one. The days that followed flowed like a new river carving its path gently through old soil. Sarah and Esso didn't declare their love with fireworks or fanfare. They simply continued. The intimacy between them grew from shared errands, casual touches, and the kind of conversations that melted hours. One evening, while fixing a leaking tap in the kitchen, Esso looked up at Sarah and said, "You know, I still forget you're older." She smiled and replied, "That's because your heart never asks about age." Meanwhile, Amy and Coffee deepened their own bond. They now spoke of future things, visiting his hometown, introducing her to cousins, planning a small getaway to a quiet beachside town. Love for Amy was no longer a distant idea with sharp corners. It was a living thing that moved gently in the room with her. But despite all this unfolding sweetness, their apartment had to learn new rhythms. The same way a tree must lean slightly when wind becomes a regular visitor, Amy and Esso adjusted. They cooked separately more often, and their shared routines became more like polite overlaps than natural dances. Still, their friendship endured. Esso would still knock once before entering her room, and Amy would still leave his favorite cereal in the pantry. Nothing broke, but everything changed, and quietly they all grew into it. One late night, as the moon hung outside like a tired watchman, Amy and Esso found themselves on the balcony, sipping from chipped mugs and watching the streetlights blink lazily. It had been weeks since Sarah's first visit, and the moment that almost ruptured everything. Now, things had settled into a strange, beautiful harmony. Amy turned to Esso, her voice playful but edged with something else. "So, you and Madam Lawyer, huh?" Esso chuckled, scratching his chin. "She's brilliant and unpredictable. I think she might be the most stubborn woman I've ever met." Amy raised a brow. "Worse than me?" Esso grinned. "Different. You're the kind of stubborn that holds people together. She's the kind that holds herself together." They sipped quietly for a moment. Then Amy said, "You know, I'm happy for you." "Really?" Esso looked at her, eyes soft. Same here. Coffee's a lucky guy. They sat in silence again, not awkward, but reflective, the kind shared by people who had seen each other cry and still chose to stay. The bond between them had shifted shape, but it hadn't broken. It had simply learned how to make room for other people, like a generous heart stretching to let more light in. Inside, the apartment remained dim, but it pulsed with warmth, a place that had once held only survival, now beating steadily with love in two different rooms. Amy had always believed that silence could either bind people together or tear them apart, and lately, the silence between her and Esso had become something of a delicate language, soft but necessary. They no longer moved through the apartment like synchronized swimmers in a shared rhythm. Instead, they walked parallel paths, intersecting only where affection allowed. It wasn't distance born of tension, it was evolution. A quiet knowing that love had entered the house through two separate doors and taken residence in rooms that used to echo only their shared laughter. Amy and Coffee now spent more time at his flat, a modest third-floor apartment with flickering bulbs and a tiny balcony that faced the sunset. She liked it there. She liked the way his hands fumbled when he tried to cook, the way he left his keys in strange places, and how he listened to her like she was music he hadn't finished learning. But it was more than romance, it was safety. A safety she hadn't known she needed until it arrived without knocking. Still, whenever she returned to the apartment she shared with Esso, the air felt different. Not cold. Not unfamiliar. Just changed. Esso, for his part, tried to keep things light, joking about burnt stew or singing loudly when washing the dishes, but even he could feel it. Their friendship was no longer the centerpiece of their lives. It had become a foundation. And foundations, while unseen, held the whole structure up. Sarah, meanwhile, had begun to allow herself joy, a feeling she'd once treated like an expired passport. Her days were still filled with court hearings and deadlines, but she no longer carried them like bricks on her back. There was a new rhythm in her footsteps, a subtle softness to the way she greeted the world. Esso had entered her life like a page from a book she didn't remember buying, unexpected, refreshing, and oddly fitting. They would meet at quiet cafes where no one asked questions, walk through libraries with fingers brushing, and spend long evenings discussing things that mattered, regrets, dreams, fears that had never made it into previous conversations. For the first time in years, Sarah wasn't just surviving, she was living. And yet, despite the deepening connection, a small part of her still hesitated, not out of shame, but awareness. She had built her life around dignity, reputation, respectability, and dating a much younger man, especially one linked to her son's girlfriend, felt like walking barefoot on gravel. One evening, as she stirred okra soup in Esso's kitchen, she looked up and asked him, "Do you ever wonder what people are thinking when they see us together?" Esso, peeling boiled yam without looking up, replied calmly, "I care more about how I feel when I see you. And that feeling hasn't lied yet." She didn't respond, but she smiled into the steam, letting his words melt something cold inside her. It wasn't about the world anymore. It was about the small universe they were building, quietly, gently, and fully. Then came the moment that felt like someone had blown the lid off everything. It was supposed to be an ordinary Sunday, a visit, a dinner, nothing dramatic. Coffee had asked Amy if they could stop by her place before heading to his aunt's house for a cousin's birthday. He wanted to pick up a forgotten wristwatch from her drawer and say hello to Esso. Simple things, ordinary things. But life, as always, had other plans. Amy opened the door, humming to herself, and let Coffee walk in ahead. She didn't notice Sarah's car parked just a few feet away. She didn't know Sarah was inside, not in the guest room, not in the kitchen, but in the living room, her hand gently brushing Esso's cheek before her lips found his in a kiss so soft it could have been a whisper. Coffee froze. His feet stopped moving. Amy, standing just behind him, didn't speak either. It was a moment caught in the web of disbelief. Sarah's eyes opened mid-kiss, and when she saw her son's face, the color drained from hers like water from a broken bowl. Esso stepped back, not in guilt but in sheer confusion. "Coffee," he started, but there was no sentence strong enough to hold that name just yet. Coffee didn't raise his voice. He didn't storm out. He simply stared, as if trying to read subtitles in a film that didn't match the dialogue. "Mother," was all he said, but it carried the weight of an entire storm. The hours that followed didn't scream. They sighed. Sarah and Coffee spoke outside while the evening faded into a violet dusk. Amy cleaned up a spill that hadn't happened. Esso stood by the window, arms crossed, eyes unblinking, like a man awaiting sentence. When Sarah and Coffee returned, there was no shouting match, no dramatic exit. Just a slow walk into the living room, a shared glance, and an exhale. Sarah placed her hand on her son's shoulder, her touch both gentle and strong. "He makes me happy," she said, and the silence that followed was not discomfort. It was clarity. Coffee nodded, then turned to Esso. "Guess I'm not the only one with good taste," he said, breaking the tension like a knife through soft bread. Esso laughed not loudly, but deeply. A laugh that felt like exoneration. Amy, who had remained quiet through it all, finally spoke. "Should I order pepper soup, or are we still pretending we're strangers?" They all laughed then, the sound weaving through the room like a healing thread. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't what anyone expected. But it was real. And sometimes, real is enough. The night ended with 4 cups of tea, 2 new beginnings, and a house that, for the first time, felt like a home, with open windows and unlocked doors. Morning broke with no rush, peeling back the night like soft parchment, and in the quiet stillness of the apartment, everything felt suspended, as though the walls themselves were taking a deep breath before deciding what next to witness. Amy sat by the kitchen window, stirring her tea not because it needed stirring, but because it gave her hands a job, while her mind wandered. Coffee had left just after sunrise, planting a lingering kiss on her temple and whispering something that made her smile in her sleep. It was a Sunday again, but this one felt different, like the final piece of a long song where the instruments had finally found harmony. Esso walked into the kitchen in his wrapper and a frayed t-shirt, yawning with the comfort of someone who'd slept in peace. He didn't speak immediately. He just pulled out a chair beside her and began peeling oranges, placing each piece on a saucer between them. No one said anything for a while. Their silence wasn't the awkward kind. It was aged, matured, and filled with 100 invisible threads. Amy glanced at him and said, "I think I'm going to move in with Coffee soon." The words came out like warm water, unforced, clear. Esso didn't flinch. He nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the orange. "I figured," he said. "You two seem like you know how to keep a roof from leaking." Amy chuckled. "He's terrible at cooking, though." Esso smiled. "Then you'll always need me for soup." They shared a long look, one that spoke in a language only time and shared living could teach. And just like that, the chapter of them as housemates began to fold gently at the corner, like a book well read. Sarah had not planned to fall so effortlessly into the rhythm of Esso's world, yet there she was that evening, sitting on a plastic stool in the balcony with her heels off and her phone untouched, watching the street below with a peace she hadn't known in years. It was not the kind of love that needed grand statements or extravagant gestures. It was a love of shared air, of quiet knowing, of glances that said, "You're safe here." Esso brought out a plate of roasted yam and a bowl of pepper sauce and set it between them. She laughed when he said, "My love language is starch and pepper." He took his seat beside her, and they ate in silence, every bite punctuated by the fading sounds of children playing on the next street and someone somewhere tuning an old radio. Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder, not out of habit, but with full awareness that her heart had made a decision. "You've changed things for me," she whispered. "I didn't think I'd feel this soft again." Esso didn't speak, but he reached for her hand and held it. His fingers were warm and a little rough, like someone who had held back too many feelings for too long and was now learning to give freely. When she turned to look at him, he met her gaze without blinking, and in that quiet moment, nothing outside the balcony mattered. No age gap. No raised eyebrows. Just two people who had somehow found each other on a path neither of them had planned to walk. That same week, Amy began packing her things, not with haste or sorrow, but with gratitude. Every shirt folded, every book boxed, carried with it a memory, the time she and Esso had danced in the kitchen to a broken speaker, the night she cried herself to sleep after her breakup, and he had slid a note under her door that read, "Sleep. The sun hasn't quit on you yet." They had lived like siblings, like co-authors of a chapter that refused to end in bitterness. Coffee came to help with the lifting. He brought his toolbox, even though there was nothing to unscrew, and she teased him for showing off. Esso joined them, cracking jokes and managing the logistics like a wedding planner. The move was brief, uneventful even, but as they stood outside the apartment and locked the door behind them, there was a hush that followed. Amy turned to Esso, holding her last bag, and said, "Thank you. For every year. Every little thing." Esso nodded, then hugged her tightly, the kind of hug that pressed history into flesh. "Go be happy," he whispered. "That's the whole point." And then, like a sun that wasn't ready to set, he stood there and watched as she drove off with coffee, her hand waving from the window like a ribbon in wind. He didn't cry, but when he went back inside, the silence sat beside him like an old friend who had come to say goodbye. And yet, it didn't feel like an ending, just a page turning, with another waiting to be written. A month later, the apartment had changed, not in structure, but in spirit. Esso had painted the walls a pale blue, replaced the curtains, and rearranged the furniture with Sarah's help. She didn't move in, but she came often, enough for her perfume to linger on the throw pillows and her books to begin appearing on the shelves. One evening, as they sat reading in the living room, the power blinked out without warning. The entire flat went dark, and Sarah groaned, reaching for her phone. Esso lit a candle instead and placed it in the center of the room. Its flickering glow danced on their faces as he said, "This reminds me of when we had nothing but stories and starch." Sarah laughed and reached for his hand. "Now we have each other, and plantain chips." The room filled with laughter, the kind that comes when pain has been replaced by peace. Later that night, Esso walked to the balcony alone and looked out into the quiet city. He thought about Amy, probably curled up on Coffee's couch, complaining about a bad movie. He thought about the day Sarah would officially move in, and how the bed would no longer feel too wide. And most of all, he thought about how the strangest seasons often birthed the sweetest chapters. Somewhere in the distance, a radio played an old love song, and Esso smiled, not because everything had gone according to plan, but because life, in its crooked, clumsy way, had finally made sense. And for the first time in years, he felt like a man who was exactly where he belonged. In this story, we've seen how love doesn't always come in the form we expect, nor arrive when we schedule it. Sometimes, the people who fill our lives quietly, friends, roommates, even strangers with no labels, turn out to be the ones who anchor us when the winds of life start howling. Esso and Amy weren't looking for love when it found them in different places, yet they didn't resist the change. They didn't destroy the bond they had, they simply let it evolve. Let this remind you, it's okay to outgrow a season without bitterness. It's okay to leave a chapter behind even if it was beautiful. Some people walk beside us for years without becoming lovers, and that's a love in itself. When your heart starts to shift toward someone else, don't fear what you're letting go of, honor it, then walk into the new with grace. And if you ever find love in an unexpected place, perhaps with someone society says is too old or too different, don't rush to explain it to others. Just protect it. Nourish it. Grow in it. Love doesn't need permission to bloom. It only asks for space and truth. Thank you for showing us that love is not always loud. It can be quiet, surprising, and slow to unfold. For everyone listening who feels stuck in waiting or unsure of where they stand with the people around them, I pray for clarity, peace, and the courage to embrace new beginnings. May we all learn to recognize the hearts that truly see us, even in silence. May we stop clinging to places where we no longer grow, and instead step boldly into the spaces where we are watered and welcomed. I ask that you surround every listener with relationships that are rooted in honesty, grace, and genuine care. For those who have tasted heartbreak, heal their wounds with time and laughter. For those stepping into something new, may their hearts be full of discernment and joy. Teach us to honor our past without dragging it into our future. And above all, bless every hand holding on to love that doesn't look like the movies, but feels like home. May laughter return to their rooms and peace rest in their bones. May their lives be covered in favor, wisdom, and the kind of happiness that requires no explanation. In Jesus' name, amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.